This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Massar and Tim Stenovec, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Yes, indeed. It is a holiday shortened trading week. We got a lot going on, though, on this Monday. It is Monday, November 24th, 2025. Tim, the risk trade is on.
Yeah, look at the NASDAQ composite. It's up 2.6%. In the S&P 500, you do have 309 stocks moving higher, but Carol, still 193 moving lower. Not as broad-based as, like, on the surface it would suggest.
Yeah, but kind of interesting, right? Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point. Having said that, we do see technology stocks on the move to the upside, so we're seeing that play. And this is somewhat to do with some of the optimism that's out there, that the Fed indeed will cut rates when it meets for the last time come December. So that's front and center. We're also going to get into Fed fixating on AI, but it's not ready to make that big Greenspan bet. We're going to talk about productivity.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about what's on the menu. Well, a lot when it comes to GLP-1s, from Americans microdosing to Lilly and Novo selling directly to employees to Novo's disappointment today, one of the stocks that is actually moving lower today.
All right, so we've got a roundup there. We've got a roundup, too, from the nation's capital, including a legal setback for the White House. We'll get to that in just a moment. A high-level chat and pressure on the president to kind of slow his roll. So we're going to get to all of that over the next 60 minutes. First up, though, let's get a check on that rally on this Monday. Here is Amy Morris. She's in for Charlie Pellet. Hey, Amy.
Hey, Carol. The Bureau of Economic Analysis says the advanced estimate of third-quarter GDP has been canceled. The figures were originally set to be released October 30th, but they were delayed by the shutdown. The September income and spending report, which includes the Fed's preferred inflation gauge, will be released December 5th. Stocks are rising. We begin this holiday shortened week as hopes build that the Fed will cut rates at its next meeting in December. Fed Governor Christopher Waller told Fox Business he's advocating an interest rate cut in December, but after that, he expects a more meeting-by-meeting approach. And we do check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 1.6%. NASDAQ up 2.6% and the Dow up 0.6%. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.04% and the 2-year yield at 3.5%. Bitcoin started the week by continuing that prolonged sell-off, putting it on the path for its worst month since 2022. But oh wait, it is in the green now. It's just not very much of a rebound. Right now about 0.8% higher, hovering around $88,000. The wider crypto market also in a pronounced slump. Novo Nordisk shares hit a 4-year low after a pill version of Ozempic failed to slow the progression of Alzheimer's. Novo has discontinued a planned 1-year extension of those studies. Novo Nordisk shares now about 6% lower. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go back to Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Massar and Tim Stenovec.
Great stuff. Amy, thank you so much. She is in for Charlie Pellet. Hey, we begin with some news that broke just about an hour or so ago. Federal judge threw out criminal charges against former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James, ruling that the prosecutor who brought the cases had been illegally appointed. So let's get right to it. Bloomberg News legal analyst and host of Bloomberg Law and Bloomberg Radio, June Grasso, is with us in studio. Feels significant? Is it significant?
It is significant, definitely. And I just want to read you the first line of the judge's opinion. On October 9th, 2025, Lindsay Halligan, a former White House aide with no prior prosecutorial experience, appeared before a federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia. And it goes down there for Lindsay Halligan. I mean,
is that normal for a judge to kind of talk about maybe lack of experience?
That's I read it because it's sort of not. I mean, judges will do all kinds of different things, but you know, no, it hit me, and I mean, it's not real. It's not a mean statement, but it's just sort of the whole problem of what's happened here. Is you had a person with no pride. Not only that, but there are two cases really going on. I mean, this is before a judge in South Carolina who was appointed just to hear the case about whether Lindsay Halligan has the appointment of power. The other case involving all the alleged missteps that happened because Lindsay Halligan was by herself in front of the grand jury, that is before another judge, Nachmanoff. So what this judge ruled is something that judges across the country have been ruling, which is that Lindsay Halligan was appointed illegally because, according to the statute, you have 120 days. You appoint an interim U.S. attorney. They have 120 days to serve. If they're not confirmed by the Senate at that point, then a panel of judges from that district appoints the U.S. attorney. So what happened here is Eric Siebert was in the office for 120 days, not confirmed, not even, I don't think they even tried to have him confirmed. And then a panel of judges said, okay, we like him, he can stay in. And then Pam Bondi and Trump said, no, we don't like him because he doesn't want to bring the Comey case. He doesn't want to bring the Letitia James case. So they put in Lindsay Halligan. And the judge just said, you can't do that.
Is there a way for the government to bring this case legally or effectively?
I think it's going to be very difficult. I mean, the judge ruled that this was without prejudice, so they can bring it. But they can't just call up another grand jury, as you would normally think, because now the problem is, who is going to bring the case? They don't have a U.S. attorney in place that is authorized, that's legally appointed. So what are they going to do? Are they going to get an appointment, a U.S. attorney appointed by the Senate? That seems like what they would have to do.
I mean, what do first-time lawyers do? They don't have a lot of experience.
Well, it's not so much,
I don't understand.
But they're making her the head of the. They're making her the head of the U.S. This is the same thing that happened with Alina Habba in New Jersey, where they've given her 5 different titles.
So the judge is saying, in this position, you can't have this kind of person.
No, you can't. You can't have anyone.
Okay.
So in other words, the statute says 120 days. You get 120 days with one person. You can't say, and then another 120. And what the Trump administration said, we can do another 120. We can do another 120. Ad infinitum. That would mean you never have to have the Senate approve your U.S. attorney.
Oh, okay.
So very briefly,
and they're doing that, by the way, in Jersey, in L.A. They're doing it all over the country.
So former FBI Director James Comey, New York AG Letitia James, their legal woes over for now?
No, I wouldn't say that. First of all, they're going to appeal this. I don't think they'll succeed on appeal, but then they'll try other things. Maybe they'll get another U.S. attorney in there. I mean, it's hard to say. Also, with Comey, you have a statute of limitations problem, which there is a federal law that allows you to bring it again within 6 months. If it's a procedural problem, is this procedural or not? So, I mean, there are a lot of different problems.
So the indictments are dismissed completely?
Yes. Yes, I say yes, but I hesitate because it can't possibly be over yet. I just can't.
Asterisk.
Yes, right? Maybe appeals. Maybe they'll get it before the Supreme Court. Now, there's a chance that they would have, because if they take this before the Supreme Court has been overruling basically all the lower court decisions on these kinds of issues.
So that could still happen?
Yes, that could still happen. I don't think...
Would it happen in this term or no?
This term, yes. It would be on the emergency docket, I suspect. And then it's going to go on for a while, but the question is, how the Trump administration going to appeal this? I think they'll appeal to the Fourth Circuit. The Fourth Circuit will turn it down, then they'll appeal to the Supreme Court.
Okay, so maybe there could be more, but we'll see. Like you would expect a little bit.
There will be more. It's just a question of how much more. If the Supreme Court doesn't take it, then it's over, I think. But
okay.
You never know, because they could bring maybe different charges. I don't know.
Okay. All right. But for at least this is where we sit on this Monday, November 24th.
Happy Thanksgiving for James and Comey.
Exactly. All right, June, thank you so much. And I'm sure she'll have more, too, on Bloomberg Law and Bloomberg Radio. She is Bloomberg News legal analyst, June Grasso, joining us here in studio. All right. And we do want to point out, we're going to have more actually from the nation's capital, Washington, news out of the White House. There's a lot of stuff going on. That's a little bit later on, Tim, this hour.
Okay, the Fed decision, the next Fed decision, that's just about 2.5 weeks away.
Soon.
You keeping track?
I am.
Okay. Like everyone else, policymakers at the Fed are increasingly obsessed with AI and its promise of a turbocharged economy. They're just not ready to make a big call in the revolution is underway. So writes Bloomberg's Enda Curran. He's Bloomberg News global economy reporter. He joins us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. And you write that analysts across the financial world are scouring data for signs that AI is making the economy more productive. That's certainly the holy grail of new technology. Are they finding out that it is making us more productive? Is it making the economy more productive?
Well, that's the big question. So the question right now is, are we in a kind of a 1990s style tech boom where the economy grew, people's wages increased, but ultimately inflation didn't take off? So the Fed at that time was able to keep interest rates low. That's a benign outcome. Of course, the other side of the debate is, actually, we could be, even if we do get a so-called productivity gain where we all work smarter, that will be outweighed by job destruction and, of course, broader societal destruction that kind of an AI revolution will bring. Now, you know, on paper, all of this is quite abstract. It sounds academic. What does an AI-driven productivity boom even mean? But these technological changes are happening fast, happening in real time, and hardly a week goes by now without somebody from the Federal Reserve commenting on how AI might impact the economy and how it may impact productivity. And then there's also a very salient political angle to it, because Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, for example, he's pushing a line that we're in a Greenspan boom, and that just like back in the 1990s when technology drove economic growth without inflation, and then Fed Chairman Greenspan held his nerve without raising interest rates, this time around the Fed shouldn't be worrying about inflation given what's going to be happening with productivity. They should go ahead and cut interest rates. So, as I say to you, it's somewhat of an academic, abstract debate, certainly not one on Main Street, but it's very, very important in terms of how this ultimately does diffuse through the entire economy.
You know, I also often wonder, too, like, how does the Federal Reserve and the regional banks, like, how do they go about analyzing something like AI that some say we're still early on, that it's the spend, but we're waiting to really see the ROI for a lot of different companies and a lot of different industries?
Well, it's tricky. I mean, the concept of productivity is difficult to measure anyway. The statisticians will freely admit that. So when you try to nut out how exactly large the LLMs or ChatGPTs and the like are impacting how we're all working, that kind of adds to what's already a complicated job. A lot of economists will tell you one of the biggest problems is we don't measure productivity correctly, and we're not geared up to even measure AI. So just to be clear, there's going to be question marks over that. And then, anyway, it takes time for it to come through into data. It could take a year, several years before policymakers can look back and go, hey, look, actually back then the US economy was going through this major tech boom that did lift productivity, and that's why inflation stayed low, but we made the decisions we made at the time. So there's a lot of unknowns in this, but Yep, sorry, go ahead.
No, I want to just jump in, because in your story you mentioned Kevin Hassett, head of President Trump's National Economic Council, and he said AI is lifting worker productivity at a, quote, remarkable rate. BlackRock's executive Rick Reeder said, quote, we are in a productivity revolution. So are they doing that based on data?
So, I mean, there has been some uptick in productivity, and you're absolutely right. Some of these candidates for Fed chair have been explicit in the view that AI is already impacting productivity in a very positive way. And there are different ways you can slice and dice that, but I think perhaps more objective or impartial economists or observers make the point that I was trying to articulate there, that that's very possible, but we just don't yet know because it's very complicated to measure it, and they're trying to figure out how to gauge how it's impacting the economy and how it's diffusing through the economy. But let me be clear, though, we all know, and everyone around us, that this kind of technology is being adapted everywhere at a very fast rate. I spoke to companies for this news article, spoke to one company who's in the HVAC space, and he explained to me how HVAC technicians are using his proprietary LLM software to help them on repairs to old equipment in houses around the country, and he said it saves them up to 8 hours a week. So we're in this dilemma. We're in a dilemma where we know the technology is being deployed, and we know people are using it, but we don't yet know just how it is impacting the economy, and that's the big question here.
Yeah, we also don't know what kind of dislocation it will be ultimately for the labor market. Maybe, there might be a few years where things are a little disrupted and a little uncomfortable. At least some say that. Enda Curran, global economy reporter, Bloomberg News, joining us from our Washington, D.C.
That's not
bureau.
the natural state of things, where we're just uncomfortable and unsure.
We know when things like, we go through these technological changes, things can be a little uncomfortable.
Well, let's stay on the U.S. economy as we get ready for a U.S. government read on retail sales for the month of September. The data, that's coming out tomorrow. That may give the U.S. bond market some direction. Carol, it's on track for a small gain in November after rising in 8 of the prior 10 months, even as the market is mired below October's price highs. And yields, they're range-bound.
They are indeed. Let's get to it. Let's continue on the U.S. economy and U.S. Treasuries. Back with us is Jennifer Lee. She's Senior Economist and Managing Director of Economics over at BMO Capital Markets. They've got just over $1 trillion in assets. That was as of the end of the second quarter. Jennifer joining us once again from Toronto. Jennifer, great to have you here. We did talk last on September 10th. It was just before the longest U.S. government shutdown began. It's now over. The data desert is no more. What's your read on the U.S. economy as we start to get some data points?
Well, first of all, good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me on. And by the way, my head is spinning thinking about all the politics that's going on and all this AI productivity stuff. And now we've got all the data. So there's going to be a lot of more spinning going around. And I mean, so far, we haven't had a very clear read on the economy from some of the data that we've seen so far. I mean, I guess I could say that it's been pretty still steady, resilient, if you will. But, the data are kind of old, right? And I sort of have to wonder, how much we're going to see in terms of revisions in coming months as well, just given that the shutdown seems like it just ended and, everyone was like, hustle back to work and let's start getting those surveys and all the data points out. So I think we have to take everything with a grain of salt. Plus, all of this data is coming before the shutdown, before that 43-day long shutdown. So we're going to see some highs. We're probably going to see some lows. So we're going to have to probably go towards the new year before we start seeing some cleaner data because the shutdown will be over unless it starts again on January 30th. And of course, we're going to see some revisions. So far, I will say this, a long-winded way of answering your question. So far, it seems like it's okay.
Not ready to start talking about another government shutdown at this point, Jennifer. Before we get there, we'll get some other data.
Too soon?
Even during the shutdown, we did get some alternative data, and it seemed to indicate, and also commentary coming from companies, that the labor market in the U.S. is weakening. And I wonder which part of the Fed's dual mandate the Fed should be more focused on right now. Is it stable prices or is it maximum employment?
I think right now the focus is on the job market. If you had asked me this like a month ago or so, I would have said inflation, and I would have been very lonely, I think, saying that, because at that point I was still quite concerned about inflation, and I was saying that it's still too early, even though we were like in October and all that. But just the fact that we are seeing some deals being made, we're seeing tariffs being lowered, I think it was like this morning or over the weekend, with some tariffs of 40% being brought down from Brazil, for example. So that will help food prices come down a little bit in the U.S. So that gives me some comfort that we are seeing inflation, we should be seeing inflation moderate in the months ahead. Because of that, I'm thinking that the Fed is probably rightfully focusing on the jobs front, and we'll have to see how that happens. I think, it's basically a coin toss at this point with the December meeting between inflation and all that. But I think they're going to err on the side of caution and focus on jobs and probably go for another 25 basis point cut on December 10th.
Do you have any clarity when it comes to 2026?
We are still seeing, and again, this is all hopefully like a lot of these tariffs and all these deals will be settled by earlier in the year, and we'll hopefully see inflation, moderating further. And because we'll see some clarity on the trade front, we should hopefully see some of the job market indicators leveling off as well, being a little bit more steady. Because I think a lot of the worker or employers earlier in the year did not know what was going on the trade front, so they were holding off on hiring and firing or laying off workers, but they held off for a long time, and now we're starting to see some of those layoffs come into play. We saw like a big increase in the number of permanent layoffs, for example, in that September jobs report. So hopefully with some clarity on that front, some clarity on the fiscal front, and then now we're going to be focusing on the USMCA. We're going to be focusing on the midterms, which is not until November, but time just goes by just like that, right? So with some clarity again on the trade front, tariffs coming down, I think that will hopefully be a little bit better on for jobs. But in the meantime, we still look for, after a December rate cut, we still look for about 3 more rate cuts to come from the Fed, just kind of spaced out on a quarterly basis.
All right, just want to mention 10-year note at 4.03%, 2-year note, shorter end of the yield curve, 3.50. Jennifer Lee, she's Senior Economist, Managing Director of Economics over at BMO Capital Markets. Hey, still ahead, investors in the world just gobbling up everything and anything to do with GLP-1 drugs, or so it seems. We have a ton of headlines we're going to get to. That's coming up next. This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. The Bureau of Economic Analysis says the advanced estimate of third quarter GDP has been canceled. Those figures were originally scheduled to be released October 30th, but were delayed by the federal government shutdown. The September income and spending report, which includes the Fed's preferred inflation gauge, will be released December 5th. A pill version of Ozempic failed to slow the progression of Alzheimer's disease in a pair of high-risk studies. That has led Novo Nordisk to discontinue a planned one-year extension of those studies. Shares of Novo Nordisk now down about 6%. Alibaba shares about 5% higher after the e-commerce company announced the number of downloads its new app reached. Alibaba is scheduled to report its second quarter results tomorrow. That stock is up 90% this year. Tech stocks are pushing markets higher. We check those markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 1.5%. NASDAQ up 2.6%. The Dow is up about 0.5%. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.03%. The 2-year yield at 3.5%. And Bitcoin is up now 0.75%, hovering around $88,000. President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke by phone earlier today to talk about trade, Taiwan, and Ukraine. President Trump posting on social media that Xi invited him to visit Beijing in April. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Massar and Tim Stenovec.
All right. Thank you so much. Amy Morris there, in for Charlie Pellet. Hey, you know, there is a big financial and business trend when its own top search on the Bloomberg is there. And I'm talking about specifically top GLP-1.
Right, like there's top AI.
Right.
You know, there's top
world.
Yeah. There's top GLP-1.
There's top GLP-1. Like there was so much that I feel like over the last week or so has come at us. So I'm like, I just got to make sure I'm not missing anything. So that's why I went to top GLP-1. Listen, it's all about the news on the blockbuster obesity drugs that have been nonstop. I feel like part of our narrative for almost 3 years now, which is kind of hard to get our head around. Among the news today, reporting that Americans are microdosing to stay thin on these obesity drugs. You had Novo coming out saying a pill version of Ozempic failed to slow the progression of Alzheimer's. And then, Tim, last week we were talking about Eli Lilly and Novo's plans to sell their obesity shots to employers. I'm just scratching the surface here.
Yeah, there's more, but let's just get into it with Bloomberg News health reporter Madison Muller. She joins us from Chicago. Madison, as always, when it comes to GLP-1s, there's a lot. I want to start with the news about Novo Nordisk saying that a pill version of Ozempic failed to slow the progression of Alzheimer's because ADRs of Novo down about 6% as we speak. Does this mean that the GLP-1s don't slow the progression of Alzheimer's, or does it mean that the pill form of a GLP-1 doesn't slow the progression of Alzheimer's?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Tim. And I think that that's something that we're going to have to see, and Novo's going to have to decide whether they're going to continue doing other studies in this space, looking at maybe Ozempic or Wegovy, the shot versions of these GLP-1 drugs in Alzheimer's. But for now, it's a disappointment to investors who have had a pretty rough year with Novo. I mean, I think that this was sort of one of the last things that people were holding on to with this company that has really had a lot of challenges this year between CEO turnover and really losing their lead to Eli Lilly. And so this is something that it was a long shot to begin with. I mean, looking at an obesity drug to prevent or slow down the progression of Alzheimer's is not something that is maybe one of the first studies that these companies would run. But it was something that could have had a huge upside for Novo and obviously a big benefit for patients. And so, again, goes back to that point of whether the company will see that or think that there is something to continue studying here, or whether they're just going to sort of throw in the towel.
You know, that's what struck me, Madison, is it just felt a little random. I mean, I know it's about, these guys have got to be thinking about repurposing and really more importantly, finding other indications, right, for these drugs, which, the three of us have talked about and kind of joked. It felt like this was kind of the all-in-one elixir that's going to fix all that ails us, or at least a lot of stuff. And we have seen some other, ailments that as a result of basically losing weight, that you have a better health outcome.
Heart disease, sleep apnea, those sorts of things. Obviously check with your doctor, but these are the things that we see as the second order effects from people losing weight.
Totally. So was it crazy for Novo to do this, or was it random? Because I don't know, it just felt a little odd.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, it is one of those things that these companies are studying these drugs in so many different conditions, some of which you guys just listed, and some of which are related to obesity and, are known sort of known to help when you lose weight, that these other health benefits will happen sort of after that. But Alzheimer's always seemed like one that was sort of a little bit outside of that box. I mean, we do know that there are obviously links between inflammation, diabetes, Alzheimer's, sort of all of these things that fall under the category of metabolic health. And we do know that these drugs have an impact in the brain. I mean, there are GLP-1 receptors in the brain, and there's this signaling that happens. And so we know that the brain plays a role in just this whole ecosystem of how these drugs work. And there have been some earlier stage studies or population, like looking at sort of not an actual clinical trial, but looking in a population of people that are on these drugs, seeing some benefit in Alzheimer's or dementia and things like that. So there were signals, and, the company, I think, would say that it is on them and it is their responsibility to investigate all of these things and to look at the potential promise in many different conditions, especially for a disease like Alzheimer's, for which there aren't that great of treatments, and there aren't that many on the market. And so sort of owed it to patients to look into this, even though the signal wasn't super strong.
Hey, to shift gears just a little bit, but staying on Novo Nordisk, we were looking at a chart on the screen that showed shares of Novo Nordisk down close to 50% so far this year, more than 50%. This is Novo, not the ADRs, but this is Novo. Eli Lilly, on the other hand, shares so far this year up 38%, and in fact, last week becoming the first healthcare company to reach $1 trillion. How have these two companies had such different years when it is the GLP-1 drugs that have led to so much of the success over the past couple of years?
Totally. And it's a great question, because it really is at the beginning of this year, at 2025, where their paths really diverged. I mean, if we go back to, I think it was winter 2024, Novo investors were really, really waiting and closely watching for this next generation drug called CagriSema that Novo had really been hyping up, 25% weight loss. And Lilly already has a next generation drug that they're working on. And then that drug, CagriSema, failed to meet the bar that the company really set for it and that investors had been hoping for. And I felt like that was where things started turning for Novo. From then on, they started out the year on a not so great foot. And continued sort of losing their lead to Lilly as Zepbound really surpassed Wegovy in terms of new prescriptions and popularity. And Lilly was quicker and maybe more innovative in looking at how to get their drugs to patients. And so they started doing Lilly Direct. Novo followed suit, several months later. So Lilly was a bit quicker in sort of navigating the challenges with compounding pharmacies, getting their drugs to patients more quickly, looking at how to discount the price of the medications to compete with these compounding pharmacies and telehealth companies a bit too. And so Novo has been a bit slower sort of on all of these competitive things that Lilly has just been so quick to the punch and willing to try, I think, maybe riskier strategies that have really paid off. And then in terms of the science and just the pipeline, Lilly has really been trying to, I think, their strategy is to have a drug for everyone across the board, across the obesity spectrum. And they are just looking at everything. Whereas Novo was really caught up on semaglutide and the promise of that, which it's an incredible drug. It's that's what Ozempic and Wegovy are. But that's sort of, according to experts at least, they relied a little bit too much, rested too much on their laurels with that. And so they weren't as fast as Lilly to maybe go after other molecules, do other studies, and take more of a risk-taking approach.
What do we need to know about, and I just feel like, in general, though, it does feel like there might be some starts and stops where people like the horse race a little bit. But tell me if we're wrong. Is there one company, is it Eli Lilly, that's kind of top of the pack and they really own it right now? I feel like we talked about Novo for so long.
For sure. Lilly has really come from behind. They weren't first to the market. Zepbound came out a bit after Wegovy. And they sort of fell into the same supply challenges that Novo did. But their problems were different, and that allowed Lilly to sort of get out of those supply issues a bit faster than Novo, which gave them a bit of a leg up. And then, like I was saying, they were able to get directly to consumers a bit faster and fend off these compounding pharmacies, which have really been an issue for Novo. They are continuing to eat into Novo's market share. And so Lilly has been able to surpass Novo in terms of new prescriptions and the popularity and demand for their medications. And I mean, we've just seen Lilly balloon into this giant healthcare behemoth over the last year. I mean, $1 trillion valuation is crazy for any company, but especially a healthcare company. This is the first time something like that's happened. And even though Lilly, so much of the focus over the last year or 2 years has been weight loss drugs, Lilly is a pretty diversified company, and they have some other things going on. They have an Alzheimer's treatment. They have a big pipeline of cancer drugs that they're working on, inflammation, and Novo just doesn't have those other things. It's just diabetes and weight loss.
It's always about the pipeline.
Well, Madison, we said that there's a lot to get to, and we want to get to another story. You, along with Jessica Nix, out today about, we call these obesity drugs, colloquially, right? But there's this new movement that some telehealth providers are saying, essentially, hey, this is not for obesity. Enter microdosing. What's going on here?
So this is something, I mean, really, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but Jess and I constantly on our social media feeds, it's like anytime you open Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, we're getting another ad for microdosing GLP-1s, or we're getting ads just for GLP-1s, and it's like, lose a couple pounds, lose weight, lose 11 pounds by Thanksgiving. And it's like these crazy numbers, and we're seeing the ads with people that are not obese and who are at a healthy weight, maybe in a bikini. And we were like, what is going on here? And so we started looking into it, and just, I mean, it's obvious that there are increasing marketing and advertising that's going into getting these drugs to a wider patient population. And one of the ways that these telehealth companies are doing that is by advertising them to people who don't necessarily need them. Obviously, we all have our we're super aware of our bodies in the United States, and especially as women, that's something that constantly comes up. And so these companies have sort of capitalized on that, and they've been pretty successful. But it's also happened without a lot of oversight from health regulators like the FDA, and it's really proliferated in the last few months, last year. And so that's what we were exploring a bit in this story.
Well, listen, it's a great story, all of this reporting, and we're so glad we were able to finally catch up with you. And speaking of about looking your best, you have a great story on Botox. We have run out of time, but promise me you'll come back because we want to talk about this, because a little bit of a Botox backlash. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Hey.
I mean, anything's possible.
Also, speaking of microdosing a little bit of Botox, right?
I guess so.
Yeah. Medical aesthetics.
Macrodosing.
Medical aesthetics.
Or pushback.
Yeah.
Madison, you are amazing. Madison Muller, health reporter at Bloomberg News, joining us from Chicago, Illinois. And highly recommend you check out her stories about the fight to save AbbVie's $2.7 billion Botox empire. It's a Bloomberg Businessweek story. More when we continue on this Monday.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Amazon says it'll spend as much as $50 billion expanding its capacity to provide artificial intelligence and high-performance computing services to U.S. government entities. Amazon Web Services says it plans to break ground next year on what will ultimately be 1.3 gigawatts of additional capacity across data centers designed for federal agencies. And the tech markets are pushing the stocks higher. We check them for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 1.5%. NASDAQ now up 2.6%. And the Dow up about 0.5%. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.04%. And the 2-year yield at 3.5%. Checking Bitcoin now, it's higher today, up 0.8%, hovering around $88,000. The Bureau of Economic Analysis says the advance estimate of third quarter GDP has been canceled. The figures were supposed to come out on October 30th. They were delayed by the federal government shutdown. The September income and spending report, which includes the Fed's preferred inflation gauge, will be released December 5th. Arizona Congressman French Hill, along with members of the House Financial Services Committee, are pushing for new tailored bank regulations. They've sent a letter to Fed Vice Chair Michelle Bowman, Comptroller of the Currency Jonathan Gould, and FDIC Acting Chairman Travis Hill, emphasizing the need for tailored regulations rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's Bloomberg Business Flash. We go back now to Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec.
All right, Amy, thank you so much. This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovec live here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. Well, as we mentioned at the top of the hour, judge dismisses cases against former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James after finding that the prosecutor was illegally appointed. You've got that going on. You've got President Trump and President Xi of China talking today. Ukraine and allies warning the United States against rushing to end Russia's war. So, Tim, we knew we needed to kind of head back to D.C. and do a little bit of a roundup here.
Well, there we find Bloomberg News Senior Editor for Technology and Strategic Industries, Mike Shepard. He's in our Bloomberg Washington, D.C. bureau. Mike, first up, the judge dismissing the cases against former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James after finding that the prosecutor was illegally appointed certainly feels like a big setback. We spoke to June Grasso a little earlier. Is it the end, in your view, of legal woes for these two?
Maybe not entirely, because the Trump administration may try to find a way to revive these in some fashion, but the judge was firm in the dismissal of those two proceedings, and it would certainly appear that there is no avenue open through that. That does not mean, though, that they cannot try to restart something. Yet again, we are only in year one of the current administration, and the president has made clear that he would like Pam Bondi to use the authorities of her office at the Justice Department to pursue the people who have crossed Trump in some fashion in the past, but particularly James Comey, who made an enemy of the president many years ago, even before his first administration.
All right, but nothing from the White House or the president so far on this.
So far, no, we haven't seen a Truth Social post, and the president has not yet appeared in public yet. So we'll be waiting to see, but we do get a sense from the Justice Department that they are disgruntled and unhappy about this finding, and yet the prosecution was riddled with missteps from the start, especially in the case of James Comey, in the question of what the grand jury saw and whether they saw the finished indictment. It was really a mess every step of the way procedurally. And, you know, the question is whether the president will push his appointee, Pam Bondi, to try to resurrect a case in some fashion.
All right. So maybe no social from the president of the White House on that. But we did get some, not yet. The day is still young. But we did get some social from President Trump talking about China. Mentioning we got some reports initially from the Chinese Foreign Ministry about a conversation, if you will, between President Trump and President Xi. But President Trump on Truth Social coming out and saying our relationship with China is extremely strong. This call was a follow-up to our highly successful meeting in South Korea 3 weeks ago. President Xi invited me to visit Beijing in April, which I accepted, and I reciprocated, where he will be my guest for a state visit in the United States later on this year. What's going on right now between the two countries? Where are we? I can't even keep track between trade and tariffs and security issues and chips and so on and so forth. Where are we?
Well, it's a good question, Carol, because this call was not really on anybody's bingo card, really, at this moment. The two sides had just held that highly anticipated and highly orchestrated meeting at the end of last month where they forged this trade truce. And it seemed a little early to actually have the two leaders do a check-in call. And the message between the president's readout of his conversation with his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping, and the official Chinese news agency's version was pretty stark. Donald Trump really stressed that the call was very good. He talked about his plans for a visit to Beijing and his invitation for Xi to come visit the U.S. later next year. He also talked about some of the key trade points that had come up and had been agreed to during this trade truce, namely increased purchases of soybeans by China, efforts to curb fentanyl trafficking, and so forth. And yet the version that we got from China was a very different tone. It really stressed the conversation on Taiwan. And we have to remember that there is a spat brewing between Japan, a major U.S. ally and trading partner, and China over the island. And that is because the new Japanese Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, had expressed that Japan might leap to Taiwan's defense in the event of a hypothetical invasion by China of the island. China views Taiwan as its territory and has said that if necessary down the road, it would weigh whether to take it by force. Now, the U.S. has maintained strategic ambiguity over this, and the comments by Japan raise questions about whether the U.S. would side with Japan on this matter. The president was artful in not bringing up Taiwan in his Truth Social post, but the Chinese were very direct, and it does seem that they were trying to enlist the U.S., or at least warn the U.S. to back off a little bit in this confrontation with Tokyo.
Okay, well, we said we'd go around the world with you, and we're going to do that, Mike. I want to talk Ukraine, because Ukraine and its European allies signaled that the key sticking points remain in U.S.-brokered peace talks, even as senior officials hailed progress in winning more favorable terms for Kyiv from a proposal backed by President Trump. Where does this leave the peace process between Russia and Ukraine?
It is still ongoing, and it is probably not moving nearly as quickly as President Donald Trump and his advisors would like. They had given authorities in Kyiv, including President Volodymyr Zelensky, until Thursday of this week to accept the proposal that they had presented last week. But that version really contained a lot of the demands and desires of the Russian government. It was forged in conversations between Moscow and officials from Moscow and Washington, and presented without much consultation at all with officials in Kyiv and in European capitals. And they have since met with the U.S. side to express their reservations and concerns, and those specifically center on questions of territorial concessions that Kyiv might be expected to make in any peace agreement, and also the security guarantees that might be baked into any final accord. The European allies of Ukraine and Ukraine have expressed concern that those provisions were not nearly strong enough, and they needed to be discussed. Now, the proposal that was presented last week has now been whittled down to 19 points from the 28 that were framed originally last week, and the conversation is ongoing. And we heard Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, express some optimism, guarded optimism, about progress having been made, but he did see that things were a long way off. So we'll have to see where this actually goes, and if it does bear fruit ultimately in a further conversation about how to end the war there.
Yeah, and where are we, like in our third year, I believe, at this point? Are we in our third year? We're approaching four, right? 4 in February.
It will be 4 years in February.
Amazing. All right, Mike, thank you so much. Around the world of Washington we went. Bloomberg News senior editor for technology and strategic industries, Mike Shepard. Thanks to him, we did that. He is there, of course, in the Bloomberg News Washington, D.C. bureau. All right, folks, we're looking at a market just rolling off our best levels of the session. What does that mean? You've got the S&P, a gain of just about 1.4% and nearly a 2.5% gain for the NASDAQ 100. We talk stocks on the move when we come back to you on this Monday. Carol Massar, Tim Stenovec. This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, coming up on the last hour of trading here on this Monday. It is a holiday-shortened trading week, but nonetheless, we got a rally underway. But as you pointed out earlier, Tim, it's not like everything is higher today.
No, it's not. I mean, if we look at the S&P 500, we still see 255 stocks moving higher, 248 moving lower. It kind of...
It's more of a, it was a little bit more risk on when we kicked off the hour.
But it just shows what's moving in the S&P 500. And it's, you know, mega cap technology. I mean, it's up, S&P's up 1.4%, even though we're seeing the same number of stocks move higher that's moved lower.
I mean, Alphabet's hitting another record today. So, I mean, there are just some names that are off and running. All right, I'm Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovec. Let's get to some stocks on the move on this Monday. Bloomberg News equities reporter Alexandra Semenova is with us. She is here in our New York studio. Where do you want to begin?
Hey guys, so one of the stocks that is not participating in today's rally is Novo Nordisk. Basically, they took a big gamble that kind of backfired on them. They tried a pill version of their Ozempic weight loss drug for an Alzheimer's trial, kind of hoping that they could find another use case as competition in the GLP-1 market heats up. But apparently patients who took the medicine didn't see their disease progress more slowly. They announced this today. The stock closed down 5.8% in Copenhagen, and it's down about the same percent amount 1% here in U.S. trading. They will discontinue a planned one-year extension of the study, and the failure removes one of the last remaining hopes for a near-term revival of this company. It has obviously lost ground to some of its competitors, including Eli Lilly. BMO Capital Markets said that the failure could lead to significant downside. So it was a really big risk here to continue with the study.
Yeah, we had an interesting conversation on Bloomberg Businessweek Daily earlier today about with Madison Muller, just about all the different elements to the GLP-1 conversation, the microdose and Eli Lilly doing so well this year, while Novo Nordisk did not do so well. But I think a key part of this story is, okay, what is the future of this medicine's potential when it comes to Alzheimer's? And Madison basically said it's kind of up to these companies if they want to pursue other testing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in this case, the sole purpose was to try to find, another reason to use the drug when there are so many GLP-1s available for it to, slow the progression of Alzheimer's. And that didn't happen here. So it was a big gamble exploring this use, and it didn't work out for them.
What you really want to do is find some other indications that just give it a whole other market to address, and you get FDA approval for it and so on and so forth. And it just increases kind of the market size for them. All right, so from Novo to where shall we go?
We have Amazon also with some big news today. They said that they will spend as much as $50 billion expanding their capacity to provide artificial intelligence to U.S. government entities. I'm looking at shares right now. The stock is up about 2.4%. AWS currently supports more than 11,000 government agencies. They said in today's announcement the company provides services from more than 900 data centers, and they're looking to expand that next year. Amazon Web Services plans to break ground on what ultimately will be 1.3 gigawatts of additional capacity again across data centers for federal agencies specifically. So some good news here.
So is this just like a normal government contract? Like
it seems like it. Perhaps some of this rally isn't necessarily on the news, but rather investors stepping in back to big tech after a very volatile last week. But it certainly is not hurting them.
It's a pretty big spend. Obviously, right? The government's got to use somebody to compute and handle all of its own little data. So it's kind of wild. Tesla, also a top gainer today.
This is a big mover today.
It is. It looks like it's up 6.6% right now. This is the biggest intraday move since September. Elon Musk tweeted on Sunday in a post on X saying that he, sees progress on the company's AI chip plans. The company is close to taping out its A15 chips, beginning work on its A16 chips. Currently, Tesla cars are using the A14 chips.
I love all these companies that are doing their own chips. Right?
I think they learned the hard way, especially auto companies, just a few years ago. Remember the pictures of all the cars that were just sitting in the lots waiting for chips? Yeah.
Yeah, so everybody's kind of doing their own thing. Good list. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Big tech is kind of back.
It's kind of back.
Today it is. Today we'll see what happens later this week.
Did it ever go away?
Dip buyers waiting in.
Is it going to be a low volume week, Carol?
I don't know. Yeah, absolutely. We'll be here. I'll be here.
I'll be here for half the week. I said I'll be here, and she gave me this very evil look. Yeah.
Are you going to be here?
I will be here. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Good.
I'll be here Monday through Wednesday.
Maybe you can come join us on Friday.
I would love to.
I did Friday last year.
Yeah.
It was fun.
Okay.
I think you were here too.
Yeah. No, I wasn't here.
Oh, you
last
weren't?
Friday.
Okay.
Did I? No.
I did Friday last year.
Yeah, I did.
But not that we're keeping
the 2
track.
Fridays before.
No, we don't keep. No, we don't do that.
Bloomberg News equities reporter Alexandra Semenova, thank you so much. Hey, be sure to check out our Stock Movers podcast, 5-minute episodes of the biggest winners and losers in the stock market. You can find it on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you find your podcasts.
Hey, do you want to take a look at shares of Apple? They're up right now by about 1.68%. Mark Gurman out with some news just in the last 20 minutes that Apple's eliminated dozens of sales roles in a bid to streamline the way it offers products to businesses, schools, and governments, marking a rare layoff for Apple. Management notified the affected workers over the past couple of weeks. That's according to people familiar with the matter.
All right, interesting, right? And we are seeing shares of Apple, though, higher. They're up about 10% year to date. And in today's session, the stock, a gain of about 1.7%, so staying near its highs of the day. Hey, if you're watching on TV, the close is coming your way. Tim and I continuing on Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. This is Bloomberg.